Deputy Speaker. All democratic governments have to balance the freedom to express cultural and religious opinions with the competing need to ensure their citizens' freedom from discrimination. I'm concerned that, given the time pressures on this parliament, the Albanese government is rushing consideration of a really difficult and complex piece of legislation, and in doing so that this legislation to outlaw hate crimes in this country is doomed to failure. Deputy Speaker, between 2017 and 2021, under the previous government, we saw a series of inquiries and proposals to introduce protections against religious discrimination. That process ended with the unsuccessful Religious Discrimination Bill of 2022. At the last election, this government promised to introduce legal protections for religious beliefs, but also to legislate to protect teachers and students from discrimination. Despite that promise, the Prime Minister has indicated during this term that the government would not proceed with that religious discrimination reform without bipartisan support, and it has not done so. I felt that that was appropriate. I think that bipartisan support is really important for these important pieces of public policy. Which brings us to this legislation, aimed as it is at combating the increasing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia which are evident in Australian society since October 7th, 2023. The last 16 months have been a time of untold tragedy in the Middle East. The actions of Hamas on October 7th, 2023 and the subsequent response by the Israeli government have resulted in enormous human loss and suffering in Israel, in Gaza and in the other occupied territories. Australia's Jewish community felt the loss, the shock and the horror of October 7th immediately and profoundly. For so many, these events have affected their family members, their friends, their loved ones, in Australia but also in Israel. In recent months, the increasing wave of anti-Semitism in this country has compounded their trauma and their grief. Australian Jews have had to deal with racially based hatred of a degree and an extent previously unknown to them, although many have told me that anti-Semitism is, sadly, not new to them. The trauma of these last 16 months has exacerbated their received memory, the buried but the ever-present intergenerational impact of the Holocaust on diaspora Jewish communities, while it has also created a new trauma in which they have seen an upending of their very reasonable assumption that the past is the past. That new knowledge, that understanding that anti-Semitism is a real and present, confronting and constant issue in Australia today, has traumatised the Australian Jewish community. It has shocked those of us who are not Jewish, but who stand with those who are, and who reject and abhor this most ancient of hatreds. In many respects, it feels as though our society's capacity for respectful dialogue and empathy has been lost. Our understanding and tolerance, our support for other families in our communities, our gratitude for the many cultures and histories which contribute to our rich social fabric, they seem strained and difficult. It seems that no longer we have common ground where we have had it before. Our accepting communities seem to have hardened. They've become less generous and less inclusive. Sadly, rather than acting in a bipartisan and respectful way around these difficult times, many have chosen to politicise and weaponise the horrific events of October 7th, the ongoing plight of the hostages and of their families, the tragic impact of the Israeli government's response upon innocent Palestinian civilians, and the ongoing grief and trauma of those who watch from afar. Politicisation of this tragedy has made no one safer. Rather, it has exacerbated the anxiety and the fear felt by so many. I therefore supported yesterday's motion in Parliament to deplore the appalling and unacceptable rise in anti-Semitism in Australia, including attacks on synagogues, schools, homes and childcare centres. I unequivocally condemn and reject anti-Semitism and racism in all of their forms, as I condemn similar hate directed to any group in our community. Jewish Australians, no Australians, should have to live with discrimination and vilification based on their religion. I call on all of my colleagues in this place to support this rejection of hatred and of ignorance, and to express solidarity with our Jewish Australian brothers and sisters. Australia's Muslim community has also been affected by an increase in religious and culturally motivated hate speech. I think of the constituent who came to my office and told me that she cannot and will not speak of such things publicly because on the only occasion that she did, she was labelled a terrorist by her friends. I think of the mum who brought her 2 small children to my electorate office not long after October the 7th. They told me that they were really worried for their cousins in Gaza. Their small children were sad because they felt that this country didn't care about them or about their loss. Australia's anti-Islamophobia envoy, Aftab Malik, has already reported that Islam is associated in the media and in the majority public mind with radicalism, extremism and terrorism. He has reported that Islamophobia is normalised in Australia, but that it is underreported, and that violence, hatred and discrimination against Muslims are widespread daily realities in this country. So I call on my colleagues in this place also to reject that hatred and that ignorance, and to express our solidarity with our Muslim Australian brothers and sisters. Deputy Speaker, the events of the last 16 months firstly led to the Prohibited Hate Symbols Bill, which I supported when we legislated it in 2023. The new and additional measures included in the bill, now before the House, are a further response to the increasing prevalence of hate speech and hateful conduct in our society. The bill extends protections to groups defined by race, religion, nationality, national or ethnic origin or political opinion, to add sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, which is an outmoded terminology, and I agree with the member from Wentworth that it should be altered to sexual characteristics, and disability. The bill, as presented to this parliament, has actually stepped back from the government's initial plan, which was to criminalise religious hate speech. Instead, only conduct will be criminalised where it involves threats of force and violence, or violence. We do have to maintain a balance between the freedom of expression and from protecting the Australian community from discrimination and hate. We have to have carefully framed laws which prescribe speech inciting radicalisation and violence. While protection of freedom of expression is crucial in certain circumstances, that right has to be subjected to limitation, and that includes advocacy of hatred, which constitutes incitement to discrimination. Many Kooyong constituents have described to me in recent months their feeling that the federal laws that we have passed in this place are not being enforced in Melbourne, that they no longer feel safe in our city on weekends. I have responded by asking the federal and state attorneys general to clarify their attitudes to these and to other concerns, including the ongoing protests in the state of Melbourne, in the city of Melbourne every weekend. It's frustrating that just this week in Victorian Parliament, the Liberal opposition has voted against legislation which is similar to that now before this House. And the fact that we have a hodgepodge and melange of ineffective state and federal legislations around these matters is frustrating for people who are most concerned by them. The public deserves to understand and to feel protected by our laws. They need to know that they will be enforced. Otherwise, our actions here and those of our state governments are pointless. But our responsibility to the public is also to ensure that any limitations that we put on their ability to gather peacefully and to express their ideas and opinions are necessary, precise and proportionate. It's unclear to what extent this legislation currently in front of the House will be impactful. I note that there have been no prosecutions or convictions in the 35 years since New South Wales criminalised vilification involving threat of physical harm or property damage. These new Commonwealth offences have complex definitions. It will be challenging to prove them beyond a reasonable doubt. Deputy Speaker, we also have a responsibility to identify and understand the drivers that are attracting people to the far right and acting in the ways that we are attempting to address with the legislation currently before the House. The horrific firebombing of the Adass Israel Synagogue in Ripponlea in Melbourne was a terrorist attack. So too were the 2 attacks on synagogues in Sydney and the horrifying recent attack on a childcare centre in Sydney, while the finding of a caravan packed with explosives shocked the whole country. Passing legislation of the sort currently before the House will not stop those sorts of activities. We have to do more to understand who is committing these crimes, what motivates them, and how we can cut anti-Semitism and other forms of racism off at the roots. Passage of these laws in the House today will not stop those forms of mindless violence. We have to do better as a nation. We have to work to find what binds us and not to divide us. We have to say publicly and repeatedly, in the face of hate speech, no, never again.